The hangar buzzed with the sound of low conversation, the kind that lingers when people are waiting for something to happen, when the day drags and coffee runs out and the air feels to still among metal giants lined up like sleeping beasts. She stood there quiet, almost out of place, her boots to clean, her eyes to sharp, her voice not yet heard by the group of men around her. She had walked in early, not by accident, but by design, because early meant watching before being watched, and she had watched the mechanics joke over grease stains and the pilots throw mock salutes at each other and the instructors swap stories about sandstorms and survival kits. She did not smile, she only observed, absorbing everything around her like a sponge. Taking in oil instead of water. When the commanding officer finally stepped out, clipboard in hand, everyone fell into that half-disciplined, half-casual posture that comes with familiarity and rank, and she stepped forward just slightly enough to be noticed, not enough to interrupt, and said clearly, without stutter or hesitation, "I would like to fly the Apache." There was a moment, a flicker of silence before the laughter came. It wasn't cruel, not yet, just amused, the kind of laughter that comes when someone says something so unexpected it trips the brain and makes the mouth open before the mind catches up. One of the senior pilots, a man with sunburnt skin and sleeves rolled up, shook his head and muttered to no one in particular. Does she even know what an Apache is? Knew better than most in that room, but she didn't say anything yet, because silence is louder when held with confidence, and she held hers like a weapon, not drawn but not holstered either. The commanding officer raised an eyebrow as if weighing something unseen and said in that clipped tone reserved for protocol and deflection, "We'll see what the file says." They had all seen recruits before, some too eager, some too nervous. She was neither. She was something else, something that didn't fit neatly into the categories they used to manage expectations and write off ambition. They called a break, and she stepped aside, leaned against the cool metal of one of the grounded birds, its nose tilted downward as if listening to her heartbeat. She ran a hand over its side, not like someone touching a machine, but like someone greeting a long-lost friend, and she closed her eyes just for a second, remembering, not imagining. Somione finally noticed her tattoo. It was faint at first, just the edge of black ink peeking above her collar where her flight suit didn't quite meet skin, and then the air marshal, who had been reading something off a tablet, looked up and froze, not in fear but in recognition. A very specific kind of recognition, the kind that bridges to pasts that should never cross paths again. Stepped closer without saying anything, just studying her face like a photo you can't quite place, and then back to the ink that curled along her neck. Something old, something specific. He knew that symbol, not from briefings or reports, but from memory, deep and personal, and not entirely pleasant. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and in that look was everything she hadn't said, and everything he now suspected but couldn't confirm in public, not yet, and that moment stretched between them like wire taut and humming with unspoken words. The laughter had faded, now replaced by curiosity and a hint of unease, the kind that spreads when the room senses a shift in gravity and no one knows who moved the sun. She stood straighter, not in defiance but in calm authority, the kind not granted, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. The clipboard was back in the commanding officer's hands, but now it felt heavier. His eyes flicked from the file to her and back again, and then to the air marshal, who had said nothing yet said everything, with that one pause, that one look. No one laughed now, not because they believed, but because they didn't know what to believe, and uncertainty is the death of mockery. She didn't ask again, because once is enough when you mean it, and the Apache behind her loomed like a silent witness to the fact that sometimes the right question, asked the right way by the right person, is more powerful than any answer. The sun shifted outside the hangar doors, casting long shadows across the floor, and one of those shadows stretched from her boots all the way to the helicopter, like it had chosen her already, like it had been waiting. And still she said nothing. Becco's silence, when owned, is louder than doubt. The file looked standard on the outside, beige cover, creased corners, initials in the top right corner like 100 others stacked in the cabinet behind the desk. But when the commanding officer flipped the first page, his expression changed ever so slightly, not enough for the room to notice, but enough for the air marshal to take a step closer just to see. For Himself her name was their plain and bold same as she had given it, but beneath it were details that didn't belong, not in this setting, not in this group. Combat hours logged in a conflict that was never officially declared, recommendations signed by people whose names were usually blacked out in files like these, and a red stamp across the bottom corner of the third page that simply read classified. Eyes online looked up at her again, now with a different kind of scrutiny, not suspicion, not anymore, but wariness mixed with something like professional respect, though he hadn't decided yet if it was earned or inherited. He had seen that tattoo before, not in ink, but in action, in the way someone moved, the way they didn't flinch when chaos came too close, the way they waited just long enough to make others feel like the delay was their own ID. She had not moved from where she stood, her posture the same, relaxed but unshakable, and the Apache behind her still looked like it belonged to her, not in ownership, but in memory, and that disturbed something in the younger pilots who had never known what it was like to fly with ghosts. One of them stepped forward, tall, broad, trying to fill the silence with noise, and said something about protocol and rank, and how flight rosters weren't decided by dramatic entrances and forgotten files. His words were steady, but his eyes flicked to the air marshal once or twice, looking for confirmation that he was right, that this was still the world he thought he understood. She didn't respond with words. She stepped forward instead and met his gaze, not aggressively but directly, and slowly reached up to adjust the collar of her flight suit, revealing more of the tattoo, not boastfully, just deliberately enough to be seen. The symbol there was old, tribal in design, but specific to a unit that no longer existed, at least not officially disbanded after an operation that had never been publicly named and buried so deep in paperwork it might as well have been fiction. But it wasn't there. Marshall knew, because he had signed one of the final reports and had walked away from that chapter of his career with a limp and a quiet rule never to speak of it again. And yet here it was, walking, standing, speaking without saying anything, and his throat tightened with memory. Not Firth. Commanding officer closed the file and tapped the cover twice, a small habit he had developed over years of making decisions that couldn't be undone, and said quietly, she gets one trial flight. If she fails, she walks. If she passes, we talk again. Simple enough. No one argued, though the younger pilot looked like he wanted to, his jaw clenched hard enough to ache, but even he recognized the shift in tone, the change in rules. When the air gets heavy and people remember that silence can mean more than approval, it can mean surrender. She nodded once, no smile, no gloating, just a simple agreement, like a pact made in smoke and oil and rotor dust, and walked toward the Apache without waiting for permission, because permission was only needed when authority hadn't already been proven. She climbed in like she'd done it yesterday, not like a student, not like a guest, and the bird responded in a way machines sometimes do when familiarity lives in the bones of the person touching them. The systems came online with a low hum, and the mechanics, watching from the side, exchanged glances, not because anything was wrong, but because everything looked to right. Ran the pref-light checks with the same rhythm as someone reciting a hymn, not out loud, but with precision, every movement familiar, not because she memorized them last week, but because she had lived them. And the hangar noise softened into a kind of reverence, as if the machine itself was remembering her. To their marshal stood with arms crossed, his face unreadable, but inside something had begun to unwind, not regret, not quite, maybe recognition of something he thought had been lost, the ability to be surprised without being threatened. The younger pilot watched her take off with a stiffness in his shoulders, like he wanted her to fail, not out of malice, but because failure would make the world simple again, and her success was already rewriting rules he didn't understand. The Apache rose smooth and fast and steady, slicing the air like it was part of it and not against it, and in that moment the hangar became a cathedral and the flight a sermon, and no one spoke until the bird was a dot against the sky inside the cockpit. She let herself breathe finally, and for the first time since arriving she smiled, not because she had proven anything yet, but because this was where she belonged, above the noise, beyond the doubt, in a place where skill mattered more than names, and every movement was its own answer. Back on the ground, the file remained on the table, closed but no longer forgotten, and the red stamp glowed faintly in the afternoon light like A warning or a promise or maybe both, and for the first time since she had spoken the words, "I want to fly the Apache," no one laughed at best. They knew now that she wasn't a sking, she was remembering, and that changed everything. The Apache circled above the training grounds, its rotors slicing the air like old blades sharpened by time and memory. Her hands moved across the controls like they were instruments in a song only she could hear, muscle memory guiding every motion. With a grace not learned in classrooms, but forged somewhere far from here, somewhere hotter, dustier, lonelier in the tower, the instructors watched in silence, their radios crackling quietly with her check-ins, her voice calm, focused, never rushed, never hesitant, as if the cockpit was an extension of her body, not a machine to be tamed, but a creature she had known for years, one that trusted her more than it trusted the sky. Their marshal leaned forward, arms resting on the metal railing, eyes locked on the dark shape against the sun. Something in him tensed, not out of fear, but out of familiarity, like hearing a song you thought had been erased from the world only to realize someone else still remembered the lyrics, had seen that call sign before, the one she used casually without explanation, a word no one else in the hangar recognized, but one that carried weight in the old files tucked away in steel drawers under heavier locks. It was a ghost call sign belonging to a pilot who was never officially deployed and whose records ended in the middle of a mission report with nothing but a single word missing. She was not missing, she was right. The Apache dipped into a low bank, maneuvering through the Mont Canyon range that tested reflexes and guts, and she took the corners tight without hesitation, her flight path cleaner than expected, sharper, more aggressive, but never reckless. It was the flight of someone who had flown not just for show, but for survival, the kind of flight that came from nights under fire, not simulation. Some of the younger pilots leaned toward the instructor, whispering something about how she was probably just lucky, maybe even showboating, but the instructor said nothing, just kept watching with narrowed eyes as if trying to remember where he had seen this kind of flying before, because it was not the flying of a trainee, it was not the flying of someone trying to prove something, it was the flying of someone who already knew who she was. Below the training area, a small group had gathered. Now word had spread quickly, as it always does in places where adrenaline runs high and reputation moves faster than sound. They watched her sweep across the sky with something between admiration and confusion, because none of them could figure out how she got here, who had trained her, where she had flown, and why no one had heard of her before. She finished the course with 5 minutes to spare, landed the Apache like she was laying it down to rest, not parking it, and stepped out with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, only something left to reclaim. Her boots hit the tarmac, and for a second everything stilled again, like the whole place was holding its breath. Commanding officer met her halfway down the runway, the file in his hand again, though now it looked heavier, more worn, like the paper had soaked up everything that had just happened and rewritten itself in the margins. He didn't say good job, he didn't say welcome, he just looked at her and said, "We need to talk." She followed without protest, not because she had to, but because she had expected this. The file was always going to open again, and when it did, it would bring the past with it, not all of it, but enough to matter. Inside the small office, the air marshal joined them, closing the door behind him with a slow click and taking the seat across from her, not as a superior, not as a judge, but as someone who had questions he wasn't sure how to ask. The commanding officer opened the file and slid it across the table. She looked down at the pages, her own history laid out in cold ink, names, dates, operations, some redacted, others scratched out with black that still bled through just enough to remind you of what used to be there. She tapped one page gently, not for emphasis, just for clarity, and said, "That part is wrong." They asked her who trained her, where she flew, why she disappeared, and she answered only what was necessary, never too much, never too little. She gave them enough to understand that she wasn't a ghost, not anymore, and that whatever had happened before was not an accident. It was a choice, a retreat, not a failure. Rather, Marshall asked about the tattoo, not directly, but with a glance and a pause, and she answered without words, only turning her head slightly to show the full symbol, faded but permanent, and then meeting his eyes with a look that said, "You already know." Did it had been a mark used unofficially by a team that operated outside of the usual maps a group formed for a mission so specific it had no name, only a number, and after that mission everything about them had vanished, including her, until now the commanding officer finally leaned back and said something simple: "You can fly, but if you stay here you're going to attract attention, people are going to ask questions, and I won't be able to protect you from." Thatch nodded once and said, "I'm not here to be protected," and in that moment they understood she had come back not to hide, not to blend in, not to reclaim old glory, but to finish something only she understood, a story interrupted by silence and shadows now ready to be told again, not in words but in action outside the hangar. The Apache waited, silent, still, blades gleaming in the afternoon light, like it to remembered who she was and why she had returned, and somewhere far away in a building with no windows a phone began to ring. The phone rang in a room without windows, a place built beneath another place, deep under concrete and reinforced steel, where voices echoed to long and fluorescent lights hummed like secrets afraid to die. The man who answered it wore a badge he never showed and a name tag no one could remember. His voice was quiet when he said confirm, then listened for a full minute without speaking again. When he finally hung up, he walked down a hallway past doors with no numbers and turned into a room with nothing but a black screen and a red folder. He placed the folder on the table, opened it, and inside was a photo, grainy but clear enough, a woman standing next to an Apache helicopter, head tilted slightly, eyes unreadable, neck tattoo just visible above her collar, and stamped in the bottom corner of the photo was a word that should not have existed anymore: reactivate. Back at the base, the hangar was quiet again, but not for the same reason as before. Now it was the silence that follows a shift in atmosphere, like after a storm clears and the air is to clean to sharp. Her name spread in whispers, not because anyone understood it, but because no one could ignore it anymore. People began to ask questions: where she came from, who signed her clearance, why no one had seen her records until today, and the answers came back wrapped in more questions. Moved through the base like she had always belonged, not arrogant, not invisible, just present in a way that demanded space without asking for it. She spoke little, but listened closely, and the instructors noticed that when she corrected something in the simulator, she never said maybe or I think, only do it this way, and when they followed her advice, the numbers always improv. The younger pilots watched her, to not with admiration yet, but with caution, the kind you give to someone who might be better than you but hasn't proven it in front of everyone yet. They challenged her sometimes in ways that weren't direct but obvious, offering tactics she'd already outgrown, questioning calls she had once made under real fire, but she never snapped, never defended, only responded with corrections that landed like steel wrapped in silk. The commanding officer brought her back into his office 3 days after the flight, this time with no file on the table, only a laptop open to a classified feed, and he told her something had been triggered, not by him, not by anyone on base, but by her presence itself. Her cal sign, her flight pattern, her TADA. Something in the system had recognized her not as a person, but as a protocol. She understood without needing to ask, and told him she would handle it quietly. No alarms, no report, just time and access, and the officer said he could give her 48 hours. After that it would be out of his hands, and she nodded like that was more than enough. That night she didn't sleep. She went to the hangar instead and sat beside the Apache, her back against the landing gear, looking up through the ceiling vents where the stars were just barely visible. She pulled out a small patch from her inside pocket, frayed around the edges. The symbol faded like the tattoo on her neck, but still there, a match it used to sit on her shoulder. Now it rested in her hand, like a memory that refused to stay buried. She remembered the mission, the one that erased her, the one that ended with too many names missing and too few explanations. She remembered the order that never came, the extraction that failed, the silence that followed, and the promise she made when she walked away that if anyone ever tried to finish what they started, she would be there first. Next morning she was in the communications room before sunrise, speaking to someone only identified by initials. The voice on the other end was surprised, not angry, not relieved, just surprised, like hearing from someone long presumed dead but never confirmed, and they spoke in codes, old ones recycled from missions that didn't exist anymore. And when The call ended. The voice said, "One last thing, tell the air marshal he was right to Friesisch found him outside watching a drone exercise, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the sky the way only someone who had spent too long expecting the worst. Good." She stood beside him for a minute before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice was low but firm. "You need to prep for a scenario," marked Phoenix, and his face shifted because that word had not been spoken out loud in over 7. The sky was darker than usual, not because the sun had fully set, but because something heavy hung in the air, something unspoken, something older than the base itself, the kind of tension that exists before storms and decisions, the kind that presses against the skin without touching it, the kind that wakes instincts long buried under protocol and orders. Inside the old strategy room, lights flickered over a table no one had used in years. The black map was rolled out, its surface matte and strange, covered in coordinates that didn't exist on any known chart, paths that curved in patterns only a few could understand and fewer were cleared to follow. And there she stood, silent, as the others entered one by one, responding to messages without names, only symbols passed through channels older than their current ranks. Their marshal arrived last, carrying a sealed case that hadn't been opened since the end of the last operation, marked Phoenix. He placed it on the table, opened the latches, and revealed contents that made 2 of the officers in the room take a step back without meaning to, because what they saw wasn't gear, it was memory sealed in steel. Reached into the case, pulled out a small device, something like a beacon, but older, etched with the same symbol that lived on her neck and shoulder. She placed it on the center of the black map and pressed the activation button, and instantly the room changed. The lights dimmed, the surface of the map illuminated with red lines arcing like veins through forgotten places, and a soft low tone echoed from the walls like a heartbeat. Long silence. One of the officers leaned over and said, "This wasn't in the files," and she looked at him without blinking and said, "That's because they erased it before you were born." And the air marshal simply nodded, because he remembered every mission that required silence after word, and this one had always felt unfinished. She explained, not with emotion, not with drama, but with clarity. The target was moving again, not a person, not an enemy in uniform, but an operation reborn under a different name, a network that was meant to stay buried, now resurfacing through supply lines and coded messages hidden inside drone protocols and simulated war games. Someone was rebuilding what they once destroyed, and this time they were doing it smarter. Her intel came not from satellites, but from contacts who never stopped watching, some of whom were supposed to be dead, some who had vanished by choice, and one in particular who had risked everything to send her a single phrase before going dark again. "Phoenix is waking," and that was enough. Officers listened, some with disbelief, some with grudging respect, because what she described didn't fit into the neat columns of modern warfare. It sounded more like myth than mission, but the evidence glowed beneath their fingertips, and the urgency in her voice carried weight, not of panic, but of certainty. The authorized a silent hop. No official record, no direct support. If anything went wrong, it would be denied before it was even reported, and she agreed without hesitation, because that was how it always worked when ghosts were sent to fight shadows. Selected her team carefully, not based on rank or recommendation, but on instinct and history. 3 pilots who owed her nothing, but carried the kind of scars you don't earn in training, to ground agents pulled from units so secret they didn't wear patches, and 1 technician who never asked why, only how fast and how deep. They met that night in Hangar 6, which had been locked since the last time Phoenix protocols were used, and as they gathered, she gave them the details straight and sharp. Their objective was not to destroy, but to intercept a data transfer happening on the move from a rogue satellite routed through a decommissioned military drone scheduled for routine testing over an unmarked desert stretch. The signal was masked under a weather report, and if they missed it, there would be no second chance. The Apache was prepped, but modified its systems, stripped of trackers, its interface replaced with older tech that couldn't be traced remotely. Everything about the operation was analog by design. Digital made them vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury they could not afford. She climbed into the cockpit, adjusted her gear, and for a brief moment closed her eyes as the rotors began to spin, the vibration crawling into her bones, not as a warning but as a memory of every flight that started in silence and ended in smoke. This time, she told herself, would be different, but she did not believe it. She did not need Tavi lifted off without fanfare, no radio chatter, no tower clearance. The sky opened and they vanished into it, flying low beneath radar into the place where the rules no longer applied. Below them, the desert stretched endless and still, and in the distance a flicker of light marked their path, not a beacon, not a flare. Just a glint of something that didn't belong, like a secret waiting to be uncovered, and as they approached she felt it again, that pull in her chest that had always come before contact, the moment when the mission shifted from theory to truth. Technician confirmed the signal was active, the data stream live and pulsing, hidden in the static of a storm that didn't exist, and for a second it almost felt like it was too easy, like the enemy had not learned from the past, but she knew better. She knew this was bait, or worse, a test. As they hovered above the signal point, the beacon on the map flashed once, then stopped, and a new signal replaced it, stronger, sharper, unmistakable, a second drone rising from the ground, not scheduled, not logged. Its weapons systems already hot, its target unmistakable. She didn't wait for orders. She banked left, dropped altitude, and fired a warning burst that tore through the sand. Meters from the drone, and suddenly the quiet night erupted into motion. Tracer rounds slicing the air, alarms flaring in their headsets as enemy code hijacked the nearby comms channels, flooding them with false data and digital noise. A bit she had planned for this, shut the systems down, flipped to analog controls, and flew like the sky was hers again, and the Apache responded like it remembered. Toothy had come for data, but now they were fighting for time, and she knew they only had minutes before the black map updated again with new targets, new threats, and maybe new orders. But she would not leave until the mission was done. This time there would be no Arajara. The Apache cut through the dark sky with no lights, no sound, but the low rhythm of its own heartbeat echoing in the cockpit like a countdown. The mission was no longer about recovery or interception. It was now a race against a clock that had started long before they ever took off, and she could feel it pressing in from all sides like gravity turned hostile. The second drone had gone silent, but its signal still pulsed beneath the sand like something buried alive trying to climb back up. The technician reported anomalies in the data, pattern spikes and loops that made no sense unless someone was layering false signals inside real ones. And that meant the target was not just a file or a code, it was a living operation, something adaptive, something watching them in real time. She veered south, banking hard as warning lights flared, not from enemy fire, but from system override. Someone somewhere was trying to take control remotely, and she killed power for 3 full seconds, letting the Apache fall through the air like a dead thing before reigniting the controls and leveling out just above the ridge. Her team did not scream. They did not question, they just held on because they trusted her, not with words but with everything else. Uplink failed and then returned, different now with new frequencies hidden inside old ones, and the air marshal who had stayed behind to monitor the op heard the shift in his headset, a tone buried under static, and he knew exactly what it was, a fail-safe, an old one from the Phoenix days, something that meant extraction was no longer possible, and if they wanted to finish they would have to burn the map themselves. Did not wait for approval. He sent one final burst message, scrambled, routed through 3 dead satellites, a single phrase that told her what she already knew, complete the silence, and she received it without flinching. Because some orders do not need explanation, they only need execution. They reached the signal source just as the horizon broke open with the first hint of dawn, the desert glowing gold and red like it knew what was coming, and she hovered just long enough for the team to drop down, secure the hard drive, and locate the decoy. They were fast, methodical, precise, the way only people who have seen what failure looks like can bub you something was wrong. The signal didn't weaken after removal. It grew stronger, pulsing now like it was alive, and the technician shouted through the channel that it wasn't a transmission, it was a trigger, a deadman switch set to activate a second phase if tampered with, and they were already 10 seconds, too. The sky cracked as a third drone launched, not from a hangar, not from a truck, but from beneath the ground, a buried launcher built into the rock itself, masked under terrain data, a perfect illusion until it wasn't, and this drone was armed. With more than surveillance, it carried payloads built for silence, not impact. She didn't wait to think. She dropped low, screamed coordinates to the ground team, who responded instantly, diving behind the rock face and bracing for heat and shrapnel. But it never came because the drone wasn't targeting them, it was targeting the Apache. She saw it in the corner of her display, the missile lock, the heat signature, the countdown, and she did not hesitate. She pulled the bird vertical, banking it. Left and cutting power again, falling through the air toward the canyon like a stone, and when the missile followed, she reactivated the thrusters and twisted the Apache between two cliff faces to narrow for most machines, but not this one, not with. He